Gary, nice to see you. Thanks for having me. Terence Chow, head of the Wealth Management Asia business at the Royal Bank of Canada. Happy to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
Excellent. Well, welcome. Thank you so much for spending time with us today, Terence. We're talking about a very interesting topic, right? What comes next, but also what comes next informed by what we've learned over the course of the last 12 months of crisis management.
Yeah.
And I'm excited actually to ask you a bunch of these questions, so let's dive right in.
You bet.
Here's where we're going to start. Now, in June of 2020, McKinsey published a report on the early and heavy impact of COVID-19 on the financial services sector. Among many stats, one of the things that the report said was that investor wealth, specifically in the Asian equity markets, declined by approximately 10 to 15% within those first 3 months of pandemic impact. That's approximately somewhere between 2.5 to potentially 3.5 trillion US dollars in value. Now, the expectation at that point, which is 7 months ago, was that the impact was going to deepen even further, not just in Asia, but around the world. So my first question to you is this: how has COVID-19, a year on now, actually changed the private wealth sector or financial services as a whole?
I think from our perspective, we've always had a focus on what we call Asia's global family. So I think right off the bat, that gave us a bit of an advantage. Our clients tend to be much more globally diversified. Our clients tend to have also family members situated across the world. And so as the pandemic and the health crisis kind of unfolded, clients were very quick to start conversations, to start really introspective, deep conversations with us to kind of understand how should their wealth be positioned across the globe. We're fortunate in that we've got a lot of strength in other parts of the world as well. And so those conversations kind of became very fluid for us. And a lot of that also had to do with just how we approached servicing clients. Like we really take a discovery first approach. So what that means is we really want to take the time to understand what the client's needs are, what really motivates them, what keeps them up at night. And so those kinds of conversations start off at the very beginning. And in understanding that, I think we were able to respond much more quickly to kind of how clients need to allocate their assets. The other point I'd probably make is, our CEO, Dave McKay, like he really emphasizes RBC as being a digitally enabled relationship bank, right? And so what does that mean? It means a lot of investments into technology. It means being digitally enabled, not in a way where we don't interact with clients, right? Because the second part of that is relationship bank. So using digital tools, but still being a relationship first type of organization. And I think that's actually helped us as well. So engaging much more digitally with clients, but then also continuing to kind of dive deep and dig deep into those kind of initial conversations that we have with clients, those more introspective, those deeper conversations. So I think the change will be more technology assisted or technology enabled types of engagements. But I think just also much more deeper conversations, right? Like what exactly is going on, especially here in Asian culture, some of the more taboo topics like one's own mortality or how much money is grandma worth, right? Those kinds of things start to come up more to the forefront and more honest conversations happening. And so through that, we're discovering new ways to actually just better support our clients.
We're going to dive into every one of those topics that you mentioned. Academics are going to be trying to unpack COVID-19's overall economic and market impact around the world for maybe another generation, if not longer. What do you think one of the systemic changes that they're going to finally land on to say, okay, this is really what happened in 2020 has really systemically changed finance? Can you make a guess as to one of those systemic changes that they're going to eventually identify?
I don't know that it's necessarily a change necessarily, but rather a stronger focus on kind of that discovery aspect of wealth management. I think when markets are flying high and clients are also traveling around the world, and high net worth and ultra high net worth investors are very busy, obviously, with their lives and running their businesses and their philanthropic pursuits and their families for that matter as well. Time is very precious, and time continues to be. But I mean, you're literally crunched for time when you're trying to have a conversation. So oftentimes, if you're not one of the incumbent organizations, in this part of the world, or for example, RBC in Canada, it's almost transactional in a way, right? Or you have to get to the so what extremely quickly. I think what this has caused clients to do is take pause, right, for a little bit. Like, okay, my family's here with me. I'm not traveling as much. I've got more time to read what's going on. I've got more time to think about what's happening. I've got more time to consider my own health and like I mentioned, mortality. And so I need advice, right? And so these conversations, I think, will become much more kind of front and center before we get into the nuts and bolts of this investment or that investment or this type of structure or that type of solution, right? Like that discovery process, I think, will be much more prevalent.
Do you think that is just momentary or for a few years, or do you expect that to reverberate for the next generation?
I think it'll reverberate the next generation. And the next generation, especially in the segment that we focus on, which is Asia's global families, second generation and third generation are being educated abroad. They're going to school in Canada, US, UK, and they're coming back to the family dinner table, back in Asia or when they're with their family again, and it's much more worldly, right? And the second generation is also thinking about, okay, my parents or my grandparents, they worked hard, they saved a lot, they've done well, and they've accumulated wealth. But how do we, as the next generation, how do we start to steward that wealth? How do we do something more with it? And I think you can't really know what to do unless you take a step back and really understand kind of what the game plan is and what the end game is before you really kind of jump in, right? So I think it'll be here to stay for sure.
Speaking of those Asian global families, as you described them, I think a lot of our viewers might have in their own heads a picture of what those families look like and what their investment appetite is.
Yeah.
Can you tell us from your experience, if there is a way to generalize a group of obviously very unique and very different people, what are the things that Asian global families are thinking about, whether it is, as you mentioned, wealth stewardship or growth investment or even market diversification? What are the things that really matter to them traditionally, historically, or more interestingly now?
I think family, first and foremost. Asia's global families are those individuals here, but also with kind of different branches or different parts of the family in other parts of the world. So, for example, myself, I use that. My mom was born and raised in Hong Kong, and then she immigrated to Canada. Got married, and then my brother and I were born, and then subsequently I'm here. So we are an example of AGF, or Asian Global Family. So just different parts of the world where we could be situated. And when I say kind of what their core focus is, or what's really keeping them up, it's okay. How do I provide for my family? How do I make sure my next generation or the next generation is taken care of? And that means understanding or working with somebody who can help them understand what are the complexities when you start to have family members in different parts of the world. What are the different regulatory regimes that need to be kind of catered to and understood? What are the different tax regimes that need to be understood and catered to? What are the cross-border complexities? And so all of those things come into the conversation right up front. And then I'd say the second part of that is, as the world really does continue to become more global, how do you position your assets appropriately, right? What is the right mix of Asian versus North American securities, as an example? Like how do you actually do that, and what are the things that we need to be mindful of?
So with the effects of the global pandemic, everyone is grounded, and we had to care for our families and our friends that are abroad or separate from us from a distance. Has that actually made these Asian global families think more about the global marketplace, or become more entrenched in a local marketplace and local mentality?
I think it's actually been more global, at least in my experience, or for the clients that we serve, definitely more global, because you've got so much concentration risk if you're just kind of in one location, right? And the reality is families are situated in multiple parts of the world, and you've got this past Christmas holidays, folks are having dinner over Zoom calls or FaceTime or what have you, and we're still seeing the effects of this pandemic unfolding in different parts of the world at different paces, right? I think here in Asia we're super fortunate in that, generally speaking, we've managed it quite well. In North America we're a little bit behind, but we also experienced the brunt of it early on as well. So when you see that, you can't help but ask questions. What's going on in your part of the world? How are you being affected? How's business, especially small business, right? How's that unfolding? So I think all of that starts to create just much more curiosity and a more empathetic view of what's happening elsewhere. And I think that plays out in how clients think about their wealth as well.
One thing that's fascinating about your business is that you get to work with the clientele from multiple different generations. And oftentimes in the same family, you're working with all the different generations.
Yes.
Is there a difference right now, especially when you're working with those who are in the matriarchal, patriarch generation and those that are the next generation, the younger generation that are taking over?
I would say initially, yes. The first generation of, or the matriarch or patriarch, they're still focused on kind of wealth creation, right? How do we create more wealth so that the following generations are taken care of? Whereas generation 2 or generation 3, they're more thinking about wealth stewardship. We just kind of touched on it earlier. And so what does that mean? Well, again, grandparents or parents really worked hard, generated a healthy amount of wealth, and now we're thinking about passing that on to the next generation. Whereas Gen 2, Gen 3, with more kind of global views, with kind of what's happening around the world, such as the pandemic, such as a focus on ESG, which I'm happy to get into as well, these become part of the conversation also, right? So it's not just about, to put it crudely, picking stocks with good returns or picking bonds with good returns, right? It's also about how are we making sure the family's wealth is actually channeled towards good causes. Like how are we helping to make the world a better place? I know it sounds kind of corny, but it is very much in clients' minds. And I think the matriarch and patriarch are very much listening to that as well from their kids and from their grandkids, right? It's these family conversations that are happening, particularly throughout this year.
Yeah.
It's starting to shift minds, and it really is creating a different kind of mindset as we kind of move forward.
Yeah, these younger generations that have been grounded, and for most at home,
Yeah.
have engaged in a lot more family conversations, have had to deal with more in-depth family
Yep.
issues and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Do you think long-term that will have a reverberating effect on the way that they think about wealth management, the way they think about investment, the way they think about their own individual responsibilities as executives or executors?
Yeah, I think so. Pre-pandemic, and as I mentioned, when times are great and markets are flying high, you're kind of busy, chasing the next pursuit, or you're trying to achieve the next goal or conquer the next mountain, right? But when something like this kind of slaps us all in the face and kind of immediately grounds us and halts us, like everybody just takes a moment, right? It's like, okay, you know what? Not everything can be taken for granted. One's own health, especially when you're facing a pandemic or a virus that is still, we're still figuring it out, right? Like, the effects of this on one person versus another is so dramatically different, and seemingly almost no rhyme or reason, right? Because you can have somebody who's young and healthy still be very, very severely affected, versus somebody who may be, slightly older, you would think, but actually, he or she is actually quite fine. And so as the world's still trying to figure this thing out, some of the things that we took for granted, really isn't so kind of given anymore, right? And I think with that, folks really start to think about, okay, what can we do, right, to maybe be a part of the solution, right? How can we channel wealth to maybe make this world a better place? How do we prevent the next pandemic, for that matter? And what are some of the things that we should be thinking about, some of the companies that are channeling their resources towards these kinds of causes? And I think that becomes front and center also.
So much of what you said is leading us towards ESG, and I will
Sure.
get there in the next question.
Yeah.
But one more before we get there.
Of course.
You did say that even though we have been separated from the rest of the world, right, because we can't travel, that people's worldviews are actually getting even more global, which is very, very interesting. But at the same time, I also know that there are a lot of the next generation of wealth and next generation of leadership that, because they spent so much time at quote-unquote home, they've started to see opportunities in Asia that they hadn't necessarily identified before.
Yeah, for
Can
sure.
you tell me what your experiences are with those kinds of conversations?
Well, I just reflect on myself for that matter as well, right? Like I've come to Asia over the years, for fun, for work, but I've never lived here prior to a couple of years ago. And when I'm here, being grounded as well, the amount of innovation that's happening in Asia, the amount of just creativity, the energy, the drive, and the buzz that's just here, it's absolutely breathtaking and fascinating. And so I think, the opportunity to kind of see where this can take Asia as a continent as we kind of look forward to the next 5, 10, 15 years. There's no shortage of opportunity, whatsoever. And then when you just think about the sheer size of this part of the world, right? It's absolutely massive, and so lots and lots and lots that can be done, and a real kind of thirst or hunger for it as well, right? I think there's so much of that happening here that's just inevitable. Where Asia starts to become really kind of the center of gravity, really starts to gravitate much more towards this part of the world again.
Let's talk about ESG.
Sure.
This is something that I know you individually are passionate about,
Yeah.
and RBC has talked a lot about.
Yeah.
In fact, RBC very recently published a poll that found 72% of Asian high net worth individuals say that investing in ESG is really important. It's one of the key components and factors that they think about when it's investing,
Yeah.
and when it comes to investment, compared to only 43% of their Western peers.
Yep.
Why do you think there is nearly double the number of Asian high net worth individuals who say that ESG matters in the way that they invest?
Yeah, I think it's that slight changing of the guard or changing the mindset that we talked about just briefly earlier. With second generation and third generation being educated more internationally and abroad, participating in conversations, playing a more active role in the family's kind of fortunes and wealth, and actually influencing their parents or grandparents on where to steward that wealth, that's part of the factor as well. I think also secondly, there's this notion or this misconception in the past where ESG is kind of defensive or protective, right? Like how do you find a company with strong ESG principles and you invest in that so that you know that they won't do wrong, if you will. But it's actually much broader than that, right? And I think through this pandemic or through that kind of generational shift, investors are seeing that companies with ESG principles and who are proactively solving these kinds of problems that are going to make the world a better place, they actually generate amazing returns, right? And when you look at it over the long run, it's actually these companies that will do quite well. So it just makes really, really good financial sense.
Yeah, on that point, even our own reporting has found that that ESG leaders, companies who dedicate large portions of their profits to ESG investment or that are producing products specifically in the ESG space, over the course of the last 10 years have oftentimes outperformed their competitive markets, their peer marketplaces.
Yeah.
MSCI indices for ESG leaders has outperformed the market as a whole. Why do you think that is? Is it just because of investor interest in this topic, or is it because there's something about the way that they build and the way that they create that is actually being priced into the market properly?
I think there's definitely a bit of pricing in, and then there's also a bit of, you go back to fundamentals, right? Like companies do well, companies become more profitable when they sell products or provide services that are solving problems that people care about. Right, and so or there's a gap in the marketplace, and there's something that I woke up every morning and I wish I had this tool, but I don't have it, and so this company then produces this tool, and I really, really enjoy using it, and so that kind of comes in as well. So when you think about what's happening in the world, there's a lot of interest in obviously the pandemic. Climate change is an easy one, right? Where it's obviously at the tip of everybody's tongue, and so how are different companies trying to contribute or solve that problem as well? And so that naturally lends itself to that ESG side, right? So it's not environmental, sure, right? And providing products or creating products and providing solutions that actually solve those kinds of problems, but just good governance and like a sense of social responsibility, right? Like at RBC, our mission statement is all about helping clients thrive, but communities as well as communities prosper, because we can't have one without the other, right? Like we are kind of citizens of this global community as well, and if we can't help the community prosper, which includes things like climate change or how do you make it better, then it's all very short-sighted, right? And I think that's very much part of it.
Beyond the individuals here in Asia that are interested in and actively investing in ESG companies or ESG efforts, is there a community of people, a community of investors who actually come together and talk actively about ESG? Have you come across any community like that in Asia?
I haven't come across a specific community myself. I think within our client base, There are definitely those who are very keen to understand where we are as an organization and what we're doing to help move the needle within the space specifically. And I think it's through these conversations with our clients that we get ideas and we collaborate with them and we start to kind of push that ball uphill.
Besides, well, I should say, beyond accelerating interest in ESG investment, do you think COVID-19 has changed the shape of ESG opportunities for the future, especially in this part of the world?
Good question. I don't think it's necessarily changed the shape of it, but rather it's created a moment where folks are considering kind of all the other elements that may contribute towards a not so great environment, right? So whether that's different sanitary kind of best practices, right, in different places, or whether that's how are people taking care of each other, right? Like, are we still kind of rubbing shoulder to shoulder, during flu season, right? Like, I think things like that will cause people to take pause and really kind of think about things, and I think from there it'll start to kind of spawn a whole lot of other thinking, if you will, but it's not so much like it's completely changed or introduced something new. It's just everybody, let's look what happened,
Right.
and how are we going to learn from this?
Yeah. When it comes to leaders around the world that talk about ESG, whether it's state leaders or corporate leaders, it's still largely Western leaders that are talking about it publicly and making clear statements about it, planting flags for their companies. How long do you think before there is a change in the tide, and that it is Asian leaders, whether it is state leaders or corporate leaders, that are at the forefront of ESG investment and ESG efforts around the world?
Well, it can't be long, right? It certainly can't be long. And when you look at how the companies themselves in Asia are investing in kind of renewable energy or electric vehicles in China, or wind or solar power, right? Like, I think those are very much here already. And I think over the next, well, actually already starting now, right? But definitely over the next kind of 2, 3, 5, 10 years, it'll very much be one of the key areas of focus and one of the key areas of innovation.
I want to talk about RBC and RBC's, the changes that RBC has undergone because of the pandemic.
Sure.
Now, private banking, as you mentioned earlier, is traditionally a very high-touch industry.
Yeah.
Right? Your relationship with your clients is these are one-to-one relationships. You get to know them, you talk to them, you're part of, and oftentimes you're part of their extended family.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
How has the pandemic changed? I imagine that when it comes to communications and that relationship part of your business, it has changed quite dramatically.
Yeah, I think for us, we've been fortunate in the way we've approached these client relationships, that it's actually helped us. And I know I don't want to make light of the situation, obviously, but we've had more time to speak with clients. We've had more time to engage in those kind of heavier hitting, deeper conversations that we may not necessarily have as much time to do when, again, everything was kind of normal. With second, third generation being engaged as well, with one's own mortality, like I mentioned earlier, or how much wealth does a family actually have. And these are, again, typically challenging or taboo topics within kind of Asian families, but these conversations are also happening. So it allows us to understand the bigger picture and the end game of the family. It allows us to better plan and to better structure solutions and provide different ideas or options for clients that make more sense for them longer term. So that's certainly one. And then there's digital, right? I think you'll hear that time and time again. How are companies becoming increasingly more digitally enabled? How are we able to engage with clients through different digital channels, whether that's messaging channels or kind of video conferencing, while still being able to kind of show what's going on in the client's portfolios. And it's not just about the client engagement also, it's truly front to back, right? And so my team will often hear me talk about a client that sits in the middle but then every single part of the company circles the client. So it's not just about client, relationship manager, or private banker, somebody in middle office, somebody in back office as a linear line. It's very much circular. So everybody has an opportunity to impact that client experience. And so to the extent that everybody's becoming more digital, that client experience becomes that much better, that much more seamless, and that much more straight through. And in turn, it reduces errors, it makes for a much better experience, and it helps us focus on the conversations and the topics that are important, which is what's keeping clients up at night. What do they want to do with the next generation? How would they like to steward their wealth? And so, kind of two sides of the same coin, if I can put it that way.
The digital transformation of RBC, did you have to lead that transformation in the midst of the pandemic, or was that transformation already ongoing before COVID-19?
It's before, for sure. I think for us, we've always invested quite heavily in technology, which is also why when the pandemic hit in Asia, like we were pretty much off to the races, and we had everybody working from home like really quickly, and that was really fantastic to see. I think our technology partners really rose to the occasion. Our infrastructure really stood up, and like we almost over-test our redundancies, and everything worked out extremely well. And I think that was great to see. But it also created more focus on why we should invest in additional things that we may have said, what, maybe nice to have at the moment. It's no longer so much nice to have. It's like, what, we actually need to have these kinds of things. How do we have proper video conference with clients where we can share information securely and actually have these kinds of more in-depth dialogues, right? And I think that became very much kind of accelerated as well.
What surprised you about having a distributed workforce and having to work virtually and remotely?
How well people stay connected, right? Because it's, I kind of maybe grew up in an era where working from home was great and the flexibility was fantastic, but may not have been seen as productive, right? And what surprised me was people are just as productive, if not more so, and folks are still just as connected, right? Whether that's through emails or a video conference or a normal phone call or instant message, right? You can ping each other so quickly. And like I've got our internal messaging instant chat on my cell phone, on my tablet, on my computer, and I can pretty much be pinged like anywhere, everywhere, as long as I don't leave everything in one spot and I hide out in a room, right? So, and everybody made an effort, I think, to really kind of stay connected with everybody, although we're maybe physically apart. But that's been amazing.
Assume that we will eventually all be able to return back to our offices. And more importantly for your business, have our lunches and our dinners and our in-person meetings with our clients. What of the new rhythms in a distributed business, digital-first business, do you think you're going to keep in that next normal?
I think it'll be what makes sense for the day. I mean, it sounds simple and kind of awfully logical, but there are days where you may not need to meet a client and you need to get through some paperwork, right? Or you need to get through a bunch of emails or look through that particular presentation and sharpen it. And those are days where you just stay at home, right? Because then you can get up in the morning, grab your cup of coffee, or have some breakfast, and you're in. And then there are other days where you're going to have meetings with colleagues, and you need to collaborate with other partners, or you need to meet clients, and so that's when you'll go out. So it'll be a hybrid. I don't think kind of work from home or office are mutually exclusive. I think it's very much complementary, and it's just a matter of just like how when business casual became a thing, right? And then people go, well, dress for your day. Well, okay, well, work in the environment that suits your day, and I think that'll prevail.
What was it like changing the behavior of your customers and your clients? Did they take to the digital services and the digital engagement as well as the employees did?
Yeah, surprisingly, really well. And clients responded just as quickly as we did when it came to interacting with us digitally. I think everybody was acutely aware of the the health concerns of in-person meetings, and because our technology stood up and the conversations were quite productive and almost seamless, I think clients responded extremely well there. If anything, what needs to be probably evolved a bit more and what needs a bit of catching up is just the legal framework or the regulatory landscape that'll allow for or enable kind of things like digital signatures, things like e-sign, or especially when certain documents are kind of trickier to validate one's own kind of identity, it's tougher, right? Like it's hard to, like, how do you make sure that it can be enforced in a court of law? Like those kinds of things I think require probably a bit more as we kind of really move forward with this whole digital transformation of the world.
And have you seen movement in the regulatory space with regard to stuff like this?
Yeah, early days. I think there are certain things where a digital signature would be perfectly acceptable. So, for example, when I moved to Asia, right, I sold my home using an e-signature, like signing the final documents, and I was in Singapore, right, and I did that all on my tablet. I think other things where it's it's the power of attorney, I think it still requires an actual signature, and sometimes you also need like a justice of the peace kind of, or notary public kind of there to witness kind of somebody signing, in proper capacity a particular document. But I think as things like kind of biometrics or things like thumbprints or different technologies, like for example blockchain, that you can truly kind of validate one's identity, that can come into the fray as well, and it will make that a bit more seamless.
All right, so we're done with the main body of the interview. Thank you. That was fascinating. I do have one more question to ask you, so I'm going to go ahead and ask you. This is the quote-unquote surprise question.
Yeah, shoot.
And I was told that you might ask me one too, but you don't have to.
Well, it's only fair.
Let me ask mine.
Yeah.
Last question, Terence.
Yeah.
During this pandemic, what was the most interesting conversation that you engaged in?
The most interesting conversation that I engaged in? It would be with my mom, oddly enough. So she's in Toronto, and so she lives alone. And it was a conversation around, it's not even about how am I taking care of myself or my health, because she just assumes that I know what I'm supposed to be doing, you'll be okay. But it's very much about how am I responding as a leader to my team. And so my mom, single mom, raised my brother and I on her own, and worked at least 2 jobs, if not 3 jobs, and also had a corporate life, but not in a particularly senior capacity. But she's very, very insistent that she's going to make sure that I am behaving appropriately and taking care of my team members, making sure that the mental health is great, and checking in with everybody. And so she continues to do that, sometimes on and on, like moms do. And so my wife sometimes will jokingly kind of record these conversations as my mom's talking, and I'm like, right? So I think it's that. It's just my mom still insisting that I am the best version that she expects me to be, and that I am actually taking care of and looking after kind of my team members, which is kind of great.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that.
Well, question for you.
Sure.
You're obviously in media. If you had to do a TED Talk now and just stand up and just do one that's outside of this space that you're in, outside of media, what would that TED Talk be about?
Oh my goodness. It's not something I know very much about.
Sure.
I think what I found fascinating, and this is actually, oddly enough, the most fascinating conversation I had during the pandemic, was with a pilot that flies for one of the major airlines around the world. And he was telling me about what's going on and what's happening with all the planes that are no longer in the air.
Yeah.
Because planes don't do very well just sitting around in hangars, especially in humid environments like Hong Kong. And so it turns out that there's 2 places in the world where planes are parked. One is a desert in, I believe, New Mexico in the United States, and now another one is a desert in Alice Springs in Australia. And there is a huge proportion of the world's planes that are now parked there. And when travel is up and running again, it's going to take months, if not years, to get all of those planes that are parked neatly in a desert cleaned up and ready to go, and get them safety checked and everything, and back in the air. So the entire process of shutting down air travel and then the process of actually opening it back up again is much more involved than those of us who are just travelers could ever imagine.
So we're not going to be kind of globetrotting anytime soon.
I think there's so many things that need to come together before we are able to grab our passport and our suitcase and fly around the way that we used to. I think that when that day comes, we're going to all travel again and realize how lucky we were pre-pandemic, that the world was such a small village for many of us. Terence, thank you so much.
Not at all, Gary.
I really
Thanks for your time.
appreciate this.
Yeah, it's a great conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I learned a heck of a lot, and I'm sure that our audience did too. So thank you so much
Cheers.
for joining us.
Thank you for having me.